Xolani Mbandra joins us with a business update. Xolani, good afternoon to you. The latest on oil and SASOL.
Yes, indeed, Stephen. Good afternoon to you. Well, South Africa's biggest fuel and petrochemicals producer, SASOL, has declared that force majeure to all refineries in South Africa, mainly the refineries that they also run. The first majeure basically means that we will be almost tripling the imports of crude oil or oil from around the world. And it puts a lot of questions around the country's ability to curb the rising fuel prices. For more on this, we are joined by Peter Morgan, who is the CEO of the Liquid Fuels Wholesalers Association, to explain to us what this actually means. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. What do we know about the reasons behind SASOL's force majeure?
Well, look, the way we understand it is that NATREF has a crude vessel that is late in arriving in the shores, which means they don't have the crude that they need to get the refinery working at the correct speed, so they've had to turn it off until such time as they can get that crude vessel into the harbour, get it to start, get it into the pipeline and get it up into NATREF.
We got used, Peter, to this term force majeure during the height of COVID-19 lockdowns when many companies could not fulfill their commitments. This is now happening at a time when it's not COVID-19. Are you concerned about potential shortages of particular fuels, even though SASOL has declared that there won't be or they are not expecting any shortages during this stoppage?
That's actually a very good question. If I see the SASOL press release, the one I read said they don't have a concern that they will have shortages at their service stations. But I think we need to unpack that a little bit because there's more to it than just SASOL service stations. We've unfortunately got quite used to having rationing. Independent wholesalers I'm talking about, getting rationed over the last two, 3 years. Force majeure is quite a stringent step to take. But I think it's important that we understand that in South Africa, there's a deliberate averaging in the price model. So your secondary storage and secondary distribution in the urban metropole areas, there's actually an over-recovery in the price model. There's an under-recovery in all the non-urban areas, all the outlying areas. So the oil companies themselves operate in the area where there's an over-recovery, and independents operate in an area where there's an under-recovery. So our big concern is that now that there's a force majeure, if there's no product coming out of NATREF, the customers that were getting product from NATREF, the independent wholesalers, now have to go and find the product somewhere else. Because force majeure says, I cannot supply you what I've agreed to supply you, so you want your business to keep running, you've got to go and get it somewhere else. It's very difficult if you understand what I've just described to you about the difference in the pricing model. We don't have what we at the LFWA call in this industry an equality of misery. So for an independent wholesaler to go to another oil company now and try and negotiate to get some products at reasonable prices, it's going to be very difficult because at the moment, because all refineries are now importing, they only import just in time. They only import what they need for their current offtake. So when one goes down and there's a shortfall, the rest aren't in the situation like they would have in the past when they had actually refineries running, where they could step and assist. So, I'm not worried about the service stations in the urban areas, but I am worried about the long-term ramifications this can have in the outlying, the non-urban areas.
And this, Peter, comes at a time when you've been calling for South Africa to revive those refineries that have been closing over a number of years. Why have you been calling for that? Because right now we could be in a situation where people are saying some fuels such as diesel, we could be in a serious problem if the force majeure or the production doesn't start at the end of July, as SASOL has actually promised.
You see, that's correct. And, one of the reasons we want the refineries open again is that there's a lot more risk when you import finished products than if you're actually importing the crude, refining it yourself. Because the trick to refineries is you keep them up to their optimum speed. You never ever let a refinery slow down. So you often start to build a little bit of strategic stock purely because the refining process recognizes that and demands that. What we have a concern about now is that the risk with finished product on the water, there's a pricing risk and there's also a time and product quality risk of having something on the water that long. If it goes off spec, you've got to clean it. If the ship is late or the ships start to stack outside a harbour and they're not getting offloaded quickly enough, then we don't get injections in Durban to get it into the inland quickly enough. So there's massive risk when we don't have refineries and we import. But there is a bit of good news because in our minds, one of the reasons that refineries were being shut down is that a deadline was put into this country that said we had to have clean diesels by September 2023. And the refineries wouldn't be ready for that. And refining is actually a process that has a number of ratios that go with it. So when you get a barrel of crude and you refine it, you get a certain percentage of petrol, diesel, and paraffin. If you take diesel out of that and you say to a refiner, you can't sell the diesel that you're making from your own refining process, it puts all the rest of products at risk. Now, it was announced last week that those dates for clean fuels for the 20 ppm diesel would be moved out to 2027. So we are hoping that will encourage new discussions around refineries to say that perhaps we can open them again to 2027 and then have those discussions about the cost, who's paying for it, and make our refineries start producing the clean fuels that we're going to need from 2027 onwards.
This also comes, Peter, during a time when the international oil price, Brent crude oil, has dipped about 11% in the past 4 weeks. Could this impact the fuel price negatively next month or in September, October, the months that are still to come?
You see, if we look at the current over-recoveries today, and I say over-recoveries because it's quite unusual to have over-recoveries. We've had strong under-recoveries the last 2 months. Petrol's over-recovering today about R1.11 and diesel just under R1. So if we had refineries and everybody was refining crude, we could start looking at the prices and saying, there's a good likelihood that at the end of the month we will see a small price reduction. Remembering that there's the R1.50 in the current price and we've got to take 75 cents of that out. So you add back the 75 cents, you've still got a possible 30 or 40 cents decrease in petrol. What the crude price is going to do in the next week or two, I don't know. But what we do know is that the discussions I've had with the traders is that the crude price may be softening at the moment. However, if you talk to the guys who are importing finished products, they don't necessarily see a softening of the price of finished products in global markets behaving the same as what the crude prices do. So we might start getting a distance between where we've always talked about what the crude price is doing and what the rand-dollar exchange rate does. And that gives us an indication of what to expect. There might be a distancing when we start having that discussion around crude. We might start talking about the premiums that have been paid on finished products rather than what the crude price is doing to give us a clear indication of what we can expect next month.
Peter, that's all the time we have this afternoon. Peter Morgan is the CEO of the Liquid Fuels Wholesalers Association here in South Africa, and he talks to us about the force majeure by SASOL that is really worried the particular market.